All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. I think some people may roll in a little late because of the weather and maybe a wreck out there. This session last week and this week has been recorded and is being videotaped. And there's a sign-up pad in the foyer again. On your way out, if you would like a copy of the audio, you can sign up for that and we'll send a copy to you. It'll be a little two presentation packet. And then Jace, appreciate Jace being here and videoing this. So this will be, last week's is already up on our website. And this session will also be up on our website fairly quickly. So good to have y'all back in the midst of some crummy weather. It's all right. Last week we talked about communication, the art of connection, which you really want in your marriage. And as we can see, sometimes communication between men and women is really interesting. There's the group of men that were in the golf clubhouse after a round of golf, changing out their shoes, and a cellular phone goes off on the bench, and this man reaches down and engages the hands-free speakerphone, and all the other guys, well, this will be interesting, so they listen in on this conversation, and the man says hello, and the woman says, "Hi honey, it's me, are you at the club?" "Yep." "I'm at the shops and I found this beautiful leather coat. It's only $2,000. Can I buy it?" "Sure, go ahead if you like it that much." "Great. I also stopped by the Lexus dealership and saw the new models, and I saw one I really liked." "How much?" $90,000. "Okay, but for that price, I want it with all the options." "Great. Oh, and one more thing. I just saw Janie the other day, and that house I liked last year is back on the market. They're asking $980,000. What do you think?" "Why don't you offer $900,000 and they'll probably take it. If not, and you really want it, we'll go the extra $80,000. She goes, "Great, I'll see you later. I love you so much." Man says, "Bye, I love you too." Hangs up, picks up the phone and says, "Does anybody know whose phone this is?" So communication can be a little different. We think about things differently. Well, last week we talked about three main things. We talked about the way that men and women's minds are actually wired differently, and so we think differently. You gals are more holistic in your thinking, and us guys are more linear. There are exceptions to that, but in general, that's the rule. One way is not better than the other, although we tend to get frustrated with our spouse because they don't think like we do. That's by design. One way is not better. They're both good. And God's design is that 1 + 1 = +5. It's meant to be much better than by yourself. That was the first thing we looked at. The second point we looked at was God's design for marriage, that He has got a built-in design for us where we desire two great needs in our marriage, and that is in our lives, and that is for security and significance. We might, as men and women, we might say it a little differently, but that's what we really want. We really would like to be fully known, the good, the bad, and the ugly, fully known by our spouse, and fully accepted. Marriage can reflect that. It can reinforce that and mirror that. It cannot produce it. A marriage cannot produce that. Only the gospel can produce that. So in a marriage, if each spouse is if you're getting your bucket filled up with Christ and looking for your security and significance there where it can be met, then you have something to offer your spouse. So we looked at that. Third thing we looked at was conflict and connection, blessing or curse. And I made the statement, conflict is not bad. Resolving conflict poorly is bad. And my assertion was that we tend to bundle those things and say, I hate conflict. And what we usually mean is, I don't like the way we're doing conflict. Conflict is by design from God to do certain things. And we're going to look at that this morning. But most of us don't do well in resolving that with our spouse, and it can pull us apart. And so what we'd like for it to do is bring us together. So poor conflict resolution kills connection in marriage. And then I finished with the example of the backwards bicycle. The engineer up in North Alabama whose welder built him a backwards bicycle, everything the same except for the handlebars, and he dared him to ride it, and he couldn't. he understood the knowledge. Okay, if I turn the handlebars to the right, the wheel's going to go to the left, and vice versa. I got it. I understand that. So why can't I just ride this thing? And the answer is because your brain is mapped. It's already mapped a certain way that is opposite of that. And just because you know the information doesn't mean you can change. It doesn't happen like that. So knowledge does not always equal application. It requires more. Knowledge is a starting point. We need that. But it's not enough. We need more. And this morning I want to look at what exactly we need to move from knowledge to change, to doing it different. Remapping our brains or changing our behavior is difficult and takes time. So I'll give you an illustration that might resonate with you. When I was in college, I was on a summer beach project, and the gal I was interested in and I'm married to today, was on the beach project, and I thought I was going scuba diving. I thought when I'm done diving, I'll bring my tank back to the pool and let her have a try at, do a little scuba diving in the pool. She said, yeah, that'd be great. So got back to the pool. We got in there, and we both put a mask on. I said, okay, I'll hold the tank. Here's the regulator, the little mouthpiece, and this little button, you push it, see, air's coming out. So all you do is put it in and just draw air into it, and then breathe them out. Breathe it out into water. Okay, so here we go. So we both put our mask on. We went underwater. I'm watching her. No bubbles. She shakes her head, and we come up. I was like, what happened? She goes, it's not working. Yep, it's working. Just put it in, breathe in. Okay, here we go. Go again. Nothing. Came up and said, what's wrong? She said, I cannot make myself inhale underwater. Right? That's a weird concept if you've never done it. Everything in your mind is saying, that's a horrible idea. Don't go underwater and breathe in. That's what we don't want to do. So just because you know you can, getting yourself to do that, it's just not that easy, right? So change, it's how we change. So I want to cover 3 points today, 3 main points that I want to look at. I'm going to really focus on the third. But first of all, I want to talk about what does it take to really change, not just knowledge, but actually change our behavior, particularly in the area of resolving conflict in our relationships, particularly conflict resolution in marriage. What does it take to really change? Second point I'll talk about this morning is we'll look at a biblical case study. Science does not conflict with Scripture. Science really is a technical way of explaining what Scripture is telling us. And we'll see that this morning. So we want to do a biblical case study. We want to look at a particular passage that describes very specifically how change takes place. How do we move it from knowledge and get it into actually application in our lives? We'll look at that. It's fascinating. And the third thing we'll look at is 3 different types of conflict in marriage and how to deal with it. So we'll talk about 3 different types of conflict. I'm going to focus on one of those that is most important this morning. And I think in the fall we may do this again and we'll focus on some others. All right, first point, what does it take to change our behavior? What does remapping really look like? There was a professor in the 1940s, he was a Harvard PhD, and he did a lot of study on the mind and the brain and how it maps. And he came up with a concept that someone coined a phrase off of. You may have heard it, but his name was Dr. Hebb. The concept is this: fire together, wire together. I don't know if you've ever heard of that phrase, but fire together, wire together. What he was describing was when we do things and we build a pattern, our brain maps that way. It kind of builds a groove that way. And your neurons actually begin to fire together that way, and they start to wire together that way. So that going that way gets easier the more you do it, especially if there are good outcomes from it. If you experience positive reactions from it, all the more. And that can be really good and that can be dangerous. I'll describe that. One example of fire together, wire together for me is coffee. So I am not a morning person, and in the morning I like my coffee, and my wife likes me better when I have my coffee. So I get up in the morning, I need a shower and coffee and not a lot of conversation until that kicks in. Coffee has chemicals in it. It gets our brain thinking a certain way. So when I have coffee, my brain is mapping going, I like that. And so if I cut the coffee off, I could do that. It's not pleasant. But I would have a big headache for about a day or two. And then I'd get over that. And then in about a week, I'd be used to not having coffee. And there's no permanent mapping. Coffee does not permanent map. Our brains can permanent map, and that usually happens with chemicals, and that's why drugs are so powerful, particularly bad drugs like cocaine, meth, maybe one of the worst, heroin, which is in our high schools all over the Mount Birmingham. It maps, and the problem with drugs that are that powerful, they will permanently map. You cannot erase it. Unlike coffee, which once you get off of it, it's like your brain never had it. With drugs, it never unmaps. It's right below the surface. You can do rehab and you can detox and great, but you are just a hair's breadth away from firing that up again. It never completely goes away. It's like it fires together, like melts the neurons together, and it's permanently wired. That's why addictions are so difficult to overcome. So what does it change? And the first thing I would say is it takes time and effort. Time and effort to change. That's very biblical. Remapping our brains requires repetition, building new habits, i.e. time. So the engineer that said, I'm going to learn to ride this backwards bicycle, and I'm going to practice if it takes me the rest of my life. That's what he said. It took him 8 months, every day for 8 months. You know, he felt quite awkward and looked quite awkward on that bike as he tried to learn to ride it. And he would fail and fail and fail. He kept at it, and finally his brain remapped, and he was able to ride the bike. And he looks real unsteady, but he's riding it. But it took 8 months to remap. Not easy. It takes time and effort. That is, by the way, the process of sanctification. So we use that word spiritually, sanctification. It just means spiritual growth. It means spiritual change, spiritual growth. That's sanctification. That's how that works. Let me read this is 2 Thessalonians 1:11, and listen to this, really powerful. To this end, we always pray for you that our God may make you worthy of His calling and, now listen to this, and may fulfill every resolve for good and every work of faith. Resolve for good and work of faith. Sounds like effort to me. Resolve for good, work of faith. You're going to break a sweat. How do we do our resolve for good and our work of faith? By His power. To this end, we always pray for you that our God may make you worthy of His calling and may fulfill every resolve for good and every work of faith by His power. So it's by His power through your resolve and work. Which one? Both. It's not either or. It's both and. God gives us the ability to resolve and work, and He accomplishes it by His power. Both those things together. John Piper, one of my favorite preachers, says it this way: the evidence of God's power in our lives is not the absence of our willing, but the strength of our willing. Isn't that good? I'll say it again. The evidence of God's power in our lives is not the absence of willing or effort, but the strength of it. You're going to need to work at it and break a sweat. By His power, that's how we change. So, time, effort. Second thing it requires is teachability, which involves humility. You have to want to change. You have to really want to change. Let me read Mark 4:24. This is out of the New Living Translation. Christ has been teaching, and at the end of His teaching, this is what He says to the people there gathered listening. Then He added, pay close attention to what you hear. The closer you listen, the more understanding you will be given, and you will receive even more. To those who listen to my teaching, more understanding will be given. But for those who are not listening, even what little understanding they have will be taken away from them. Wow. That sounds almost harsh, doesn't it? He's saying, I supply my power, and if you want it and are willing to work at it, more will be given to you. If you just come and listen and don't put in your side, what little you have will be taken away. Wow. We see that in, you can just jot this reference down, Matthew 25:15. That's the parable of the talents. So Christ has been teaching, and he says it's like this. There was a business owner who was going away. He gathered 3 of his workers, and to the first he said, I'm going to give you 5 talents. Do something with it while I'm gone. To another he said, I'm going to give you 2. Do something with it while I'm gone. And to another he gave 1. Do something with it. He goes away. After a while he comes back. He calls him in for an accounting. And the first one comes and says, you gave me 5 talents. I doubled it, 10. He said, great job. The second one came in. You gave me 2 talents. I doubled it, 4. Excellent. The third one came in and said, I knew you were shrewd. I didn't want to lose it, so I dug a hole, buried it, did nothing with it, but I didn't lose it. Here's your talent back. He did not get affirmed. He was told, wicked. I wanted you to do something with it, and you didn't. You just sat on it. And so he took it, the 1 talent from that worker, and gave it to the one with 5. That is a biblical principle. We like it in business, right? We just don't like it when Christ talks about it, but it's a very biblical principle. So that is how we change. It requires God's power and our effort, trusting him with his power, time, and we will change. The old saying, let go and let God, that's not really biblical. Not really biblical. Second thing I want to talk about, I want to look at, my second point is a biblical case study. Let's look at that. What exactly does that look like? And there is a passage, there are many of them, but we're going to look at one, just a few verses that gives us clues as to how that happens, because it's helpful, as Scripture often explains, this is the process. This is one of those few verses that does that. It says, here's how change happens biblically. Very helpful. It's James chapter 1, verses 22 through 25. So I'll read those, and then I'm going to make 3 observations about those couple of verses. And those 3 observations will form an acronym that may help you kind of with a handle to remember. I will say it this way. How do we breathe the air of change? How do you breathe the air of change? Air, A-I-R. Those are going to be the starting letters for each of the 3 observations. So let me read the few verses and then I'll describe that. James 1, 22 through 25. Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do, there it is, do what it says. Anyone who listens to the word but does not do what it says is like a man who looks at his face in a mirror and after looking at himself goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like. But the man who looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom and continues to do this, not forgetting what he has heard, but doing it, he will be blessed in what he does. There's a lot in there. We're just going to look at 3 simple things. Before I give you the AIR acronym, there is a warning in that passage, and we need to pay attention to it. Here is the warning. The warning is against self-deception. No one likes to be deceived, right? We don't like it, and all of us in here have been deceived by people. We don't like being lied to. We don't like being misled. We don't like being taken advantage of. We don't like being deceived. The worst kind of deception is self-deception, because who's going to help you? There are 2 persons in my life that help me avoid self-deception. The first is the person of the Holy Spirit. That is his job. He is in my life, and he points out, usually via Scripture, preaching, study, reading, hey, Steve, that's not the way to go. You're deceiving yourself. Don't do that. So I want to be very receptive to the person of the Holy Spirit helping me protect against self-deception. Here's the second person in my life that can help me avoid self-deception. Her name is Beth. God has given me my wife. She knows me better than anybody on this earth. She is for me more than anybody on this earth. Who wants to see me succeed more than my wife? And who knows me better than my wife? The answer, no one. So when she says, hey, honey, you might want to think about, I should receive that influence. right? It's not helpful for me if I don't know what you're talking about. She does. Now, she can deliver it in a way that's easier to receive, sometimes harder to receive. But I would be very foolish to blow off her influence. That would be a form of self-deception. And I'll just reiterate that, and then I'll get into the AIR acronym. When I was learning to scuba dive, I had a diving instructor who was a character. And we did first you learn in a swimming pool, and then you go into the ocean for an open water dive. And you plan your dive, it's the same. You plan your dive and dive your plan. You have charts. If you go down at a certain depth and you come up too fast, you'll get the bends. It really hurts and it can kill you. It's very dangerous. So you literally go, I'm going to go 50 feet. I'm going to be down there for 20 minutes. Okay, and you chart it and you realize I got to decompress coming up, so forth and so on. So he said, now listen, there's hardly anything you can see at 100 feet that you can't see at 50 feet. Don't go deep, because when you go deep, you got to decompress more, and you're more at risk for getting the bends. And so he would say this, by the way, when you go down 50 feet, it will feel like you've had one martini, right? Stuff happens in your blood, oxygen in your blood. If you go down 100 feet, it feels like having tea martinis. Things start getting backwards. They start getting a little confusing. He said, so it's kind of dangerous. There have been divers who have gone down 150 feet or 200 feet without mixed gas, and they are so mixed up, they hand their tank to a fish and no one ever sees them again. He's like, don't do that. If you are self-deceived at 200 feet underwater, you're in trouble. You're in trouble. We can get self-deceived in our own lives and in our marriages. Okay, so what does James 1:22, how does that help us? Here are the three acronyms, if you'll notice. The first observation is action, right? We've been talking about doing. Listen again. Do not merely listen to the word and deceive. Do what it says. Real change involves action. It involves doing something differently. Not just listening, but doing. Action, A. Second observation I would make is intensity and or intentionality. Okay, I. We're going for air. The air, breathing the air of change. Intentionality, intensity. Look at let me read verse 25. But the man who looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom. It's not just a cursory glance. It's not just showing up and hearing up, yep, I hear it, whatever. It's wrestling with it. It's really intently listening for the purpose of getting it. It's doing. The engineer who rode the backwards bicycle did not sit around and meditate on it for 8 months. He got on the bike and tried to pedal it, and he was intentional and intense about it. He said, I'm going to do this for the rest of my life. I'm going to learn to do this. And it did take him 8 months. He stuck with it. Action and intentionality. The third observation in that verse is repetition. Again, verse 25. But the man who looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom and continues to do this, not forgetting it, but doing it, he will be blessed in what he does. AIR, breathing the air of change. The Bible is so sweet to give us very detailed help in how to change. It's going to require knowledge, but it's also going to require action, intensity or intentionality, and repetition. Don't quit. Keep after it. You'll remap. God will change your life. That's how He brings about change in our lives. The third point I want to focus on in our time together is that not all conflict is the same. Not all conflict in marriage is the same. So what we want to do is talk about change and intentionality, breathing the air of change, particularly in our marriages, particularly in the area of conflict resolution, so that we do it better. We want to resolve conflict better, right? Because people say, I hate conflict. Again, I think let's unbundle that and say, here's conflict and here's poor conflict resolution. This is what you hate, right? Let's not bundle those. Let's separate them. Conflict is from God. I believe that. It is His way of saying, you need to pay attention here. This is a work I'm doing in your life. Steve, this is where I want you to change. Just don't do it poorly. Don't do it in a way that destroys relationships, particularly your marriage. Do it in a way that actually builds your marriage. It's not destruction or neutrality. It's destruction or help. Conflict is designed to bring you closer to your spouse, not neutral or push you away. The problem is, if we do it wrong, we can pull away from each other, okay? But not all conflict is the same, and I want to talk about 3 different types. 2 of the types I'm just going to mention briefly. One of the types I want us to focus the rest of our time on. Before I get into those 3 different types of conflict, let me preface it by saying this. Whenever I work with a couple, they usually are in one of 3 camps. They will come in and they're both positive. Okay? They both come in and they say, we would like help in our marriage. We're both for that, and we want to be on the same page. And we're both excited about that. It's going to go probably pretty well because they both want to get it. They both are interested. They're both humble and teachable, and they want to be on the same page. Great. Another type of couple will come in, and it's 1 and 1. They're not both positive. One's positive and one is not. One is saying, I drug my spouse here because we're not doing well, and I really want to get this, and they agreed to come, but they're not really happy about it. And you can see it. I mean, you can meet with couples. You can see one of them's leaning in and the other one's, whatever. Can change still happen? Can that couple make progress? And the answer is yes, but it is going to be tough sledding. It is going to take 10 times as long and 10 times as much work because one of them saying, I'm all in, and the other one's saying, whatever, you be all in, and yeah, you fix this. This is going to take a enormous amount of maturity on the part of the spouse that's all in, because they're going to have to be trusting God at a profound level, because they're going to be dragging their spouse along until their spouse says, I also want to be on the same page. Does that make sense? So it can be both positive, can be 1 and 1, one positive, one negative, or it can be both negative. Those are very difficult. If a couple comes in and they say, we're about at the end of our rope, and they both got their arms folded, and they're like, we don't think this is going to help much, but we're here. Whew. Unless they get open, they're probably not going to make it. So that's kind of the backdrop to 3 different types of conflict. So let's talk about those 3 different types of conflict. The first is just kind of normal conflict in marriage. It's a result of having different temperaments and different gifts. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on this because it's pretty routinely observable. Opposites tend to attract, not always, but generally. And so it tends to attract, and it also, on down the road in your marriage, tends to aggravate. So my wife is a morning person. She wakes up in a good mood. She's coherent. She can walk a straight line. I am not. It's just different constitutions. I'm never going to be a morning person. I wish I was. It seems neat. And my day usually starts at 6:30. So yay for me. But we're just different that way, and I don't think it's going to change. So I get up and I need a shower and I need coffee and I need a little bit of time, and then I get with the program. But she just wakes up. It's just different temperaments, different gifts, right? And on and on. Outgoing, introverted, organized, not organized, loose, really planned, spontaneous, right? We have all these differences, differences in temperaments and differences in gifts. Let me encourage you to appreciate the differences in your spouse, right? Because if you will, it will go so much better. If you fight the differences, you'll always find something that you don't like, right? And God has given us those differences and temperaments and gifts to give us a better team picture. So I would say it this way, please don't compete with your spouse. It's not a competition. It's meant to be a team deal. A lot of studies have been done, and they found this ratio. Couples that will give 5 positive affirmations for every 1 negative in their marriage are bulletproof. Their marriage is bulletproof. In other words, honey, thank you for fixing breakfast for me this morning. My wife did that. She did not have to do that. It was early. That was very kind of her. Why not tell her that? Thank you for doing that. I really appreciate it. Hey, thanks for handling that discipline issue with our child, right? It's handing out affirmations to your spouse. 5 to 1. If you'll do 5 to 1, positive to the negative, your marriage will probably be bulletproof. Flip that around. And that's where many couples are. Many couples are on the opposite. There's 5 negative comments to every 1 positive. You're going to be in danger. That marriages cannot survive that level of toxicity. So bids for connection should be given and received often. So a bid for connection, and I'll use that term as we go. A bid for connection can be walking in the door from work. Hey, honey, how was your day? That's a bid for connection. Good morning. How are you feeling today? That's a bid for connection. Hey, can we sit down and work on the finances? That's a bid for connection. A risky one, but it's a bid for connection, right? We're all the time offering these bids for connection. They should be received and it goes well. So that's the first type of conflict. We experience some conflict in our marriage because we're just different people, and that's normal. I want to talk about the second type of conflict in marriage, and this is where we're going to spend most of the remainder of our time. There's a second type of conflict in marriage that is a result of perpetual differences. So if you took 100% of your conflict in your marriage, you could divide it between, there's a percentage of it that is solvable, these differences are solvable, and there's a percentage that are unsolvable, they're perpetual. Now, I have had some people say, we don't have any conflict in our marriage. Really? Because that's scary. We never have any conflict. I'm not saying, knock down, drag out argument, but I mean, you have no conflict? Nope. What are you talking about? Right? Is there any depth? I mean, are you talking about children's issues, finances, where are you going to vacation? I mean, if a marriage has no conflict, I'm wondering how deep it is. I'm concerned, right? We have conflict. Some of you say, I thought we have. Take 100% of your conflict and let's divide it up percentage-wise. Solvable means this is an issue and we can come to a conclusion and solve it and move on. And perpetual. It's always going to be there. It's not solvable. We're going to have to learn to work with it. Now, I will ask couples, particularly in premarital counseling, to give me a percentage. What do you think? Let's divide it up so it needs to equal 100. And often they'll say 90-10. Okay, so for a believing couple, for a Christian couple, what do you think that ratio ought to be? And they'll say 90-10. Some will say 80-20. And I'll have a few that will say 70-30. And here's what they mean. 70 solvable, 30 unsolvable. Flip it around. Proven studies. Probably if you think about your marriage, you'll go, yeah. The exact ratio is 69% to 31%. I just round it up because it's easier to remember. 70% of your differences in your marriage are unsolvable. They're perpetual. You're going to have to learn to work with them. You're going to have to learn to resolve conflict well, or it's not going to go well. 30% of them is an issue. You can come to a conclusion, solve, move on. Let me give you a kind of a case study that might be helpful. Before I do that, let me quote Dr. Dan Weil in his book, After the Honeymoon. Nice title. He says, quote, when choosing a spouse, you will inevitably be choosing a particular set of unsolvable problems that you'll be grappling with for the next 10, 20, or 50 years. That is right. Right? So some of you are nodding going, yeah, right? Let's talk about what a perpetual difference might look like. And let me say this. All couples have perpetual differences. The question is, how will you handle them? How will you handle them? This is where couples can take a wrong turn. Somehow they believe they shouldn't have many differences at all, much less lasting ones, much less a bunch of lasting ones, but we do. This is one thing I aim for in premarital counseling. When I meet with a couple, most couples, particularly ones that have never been married before, come in and they really believe They are so compatible. I know it feels that way when we date, right? And good, we mostly are. But they just haven't hit a lot of differences yet. And I'm going to try to stir it up in premarital counseling. I am. Because they're there. It's not the 4 you see coming you need to worry about. It's the ones you don't. Let's be aware of those, right? So we need to talk about these perpetual differences, because how you handle them, how that couple handles them, will make all the difference in the world. So let's define that. A perpetual difference can be small. How to load the dishwasher. When to take out the trash. They can be large. How to discipline children. How to handle the finances, right? All of those can be perpetual differences, and typically are. Some are not a big deal. Dishwasher, whatever. Finances, not a whatever. Really important, right? So how do we handle these? How do we grow in the art of arguing well in dealing with these perpetual differences? How we handle perpetual differences can divide or draw us. If you remember one thing from this morning, that might be the takeaway. How you handle your perpetual differences, because you have 70% of them, of your differences are perpetual. How you handle them can divide you, pull you apart, or draw you together. It's not neutral. Let's work toward drawing together, and that's what we're going to talk about in just a minute. I'm going to focus on that. There are 3 primary ways we respond to perpetual differences. One way builds trust, draws you together. The other 2 erode trust. They pull you apart. Here are the 3 ways, and I'm going to give you an example of all 3. The first bad way is turning away. That's a bad way of resolving a perpetual difference. The other bad way is turning against, and the good way is turning towards. And so we're going to look at an example of all 3 of those. A typical pattern, first let's talk about the bad. A typical pattern for handling perpetual differences is turning away. This is very common. When I was learning to drive at age of 15, we lived in Southern California. My driving instructor said, "You're about to get on the Pomona Freeway. It's like 6 to 8 lanes each way. Put your foot in the carburetor." So that's how I learned to drive. You better get with it or you're going to get plowed over. So I learned to drive, and that does fit my temperament. That's just me. I played rugby in college. let's get with it. So I learned to drive kind of aggressively, and that fits my temperament. It is a perpetual difference with my wife. She is not an aggressive driver. She's a very good defensive driver. I am a good offensive driver. Some would say offensive. I prefer to say offensive. We have different ways of driving. We are never changing. It's a perpetual difference. She is not one day going to go, "I feel like Mario Andretti today. I think I'm going to get with it." She will not drive that way, and I am never going to drive like her. It's not going to happen. So how do you deal with that? Is that an issue? Yeah, can be. Like every time we're in the car together. So we jump in the truck, we're headed down the Highway 280 to the grocery store, and what if she says, "Slow down, you're driving like a madman"? Okay, now I have a choice of how to respond. Here's our perpetual difference. How are you going to respond? A typical way of responding to that would be to turn away. Let me define turning away. Turning away from your spouse means that in a conflict, you choose not to respond to the bid for connection. Right? So she's offered a bid for connection. Could you slow down? And I'm choosing not to respond to her. And she gets it, right? This is viewed as betrayal and erodes trust. Really, how big a deal is that, Steve? Well, one time, not that big of a deal. You bunch that up over the weeks and the months and the years, it's a big deal, right? If every time we get in the car, she is asking me to slow down and I am turning away from her, it's going to be a big deal. We are pulling back. She is going to pull back from me because that rejection and that eroding of trust does not feel good, so she's going to start building a wall. She's going to pull back. So turning away is not good. A second way of responding to perpetual differences is even worse, and that is turning against. Turning against is not only choosing to not respond to the bid for connection, but it's choosing to respond aggressively with contempt or sarcasm or an attack. So she could say, "Could you slow down? You're driving like a madman." And instead of just turning away and ignoring her, that would be turning away would be just like I didn't even hear her, just not even responding. Just continue to drive how I'm driving, no comment, no response. That's turning away. I've chosen to reject her bid for connection. Or I could just kind of give her a glance and, mumble something under my breath, right? That's turning away. Turning against is ratcheting it up. Could you slow down? What if I turn to her and say, "You're such a nag. You're always worried." Wow. That is turning against. I have dialed it up. I have used harsh words. I've used contempt, and she got the message. She's not going to take a step back. She's going to take 5 steps back. What if she chose to respond in kind? "You're such a jerk." Okay? We go back and forth a few times, we're going south. A simple perpetual difference can turn into a major calamity. Couples that do that repeatedly over time, over months, over years, are pulling away and their marriage is in danger. So turning against is where a bid for connection is met with contempt and hostility. The marriage could be in danger of ending. Couples that turn against each other routinely in their perpetual differences will move to the third type of conflict. And I'll just mention it briefly, and it's called gridlock. Gridlock is the third type of conflict. Gridlock is digging in your heels and saying, "I'm unwilling to budge. I must win." Well, if you're saying, "I must win," that means you must lose. You might win, but y'all will lose. Gridlock is not good. Couples that are routinely locked in gridlock, they are not resolving conflict well. They are constantly moving away from each other with some hostility. They're not going to make it unless they reverse that. Marriages cannot survive that kind of toxic environment. Well, what is a better way? In our few minutes here, I want to end with a better way. So what is a better way of resolving perpetual differences? We looked at turning away and we looked at turning against. Now, what does it mean to turn towards? That's the biblical model. That is how you breathe the air of change in conflict resolution. Let's look at a couple verses that help us in that. And there are plenty of them. I just picked 3. Short, easy verses. Proverbs 12:18. "Reckless words pierce like a sword, but the tongue of the wise brings healing." Wow. That would be a good one to probably memorize. Turning away, certainly turning against, is reckless words, right? It's like wielding a sword recklessly. That will do some damage. If you're going to have an operation, you do not want your surgeon showing up with a sword. You want him showing up with a scalpel, right? Swords are not meant for detailed work. They're meant for hacking and skewering. And when we do that to each other in our marriages, you can bleed out, cause a mess. It is not good. But the tongue of the wise brings healing. Another one, Proverbs 16:21. Pleasant words, or sweetness of speech, promote instruction and persuasiveness. Pleasant words. And a third one, probably everyone knows this one, Proverbs 15:1. A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Absolutely. When we respond to bids for connection in our marriage, to perpetual differences or solvable differences, when we respond with harsh words, we're going to stir it up, and it's not going to go well. We're going to pull away from each other. We're going to build distance, not unity. So, a third way of handling perpetual difference is turning towards. So let's redo that scenario in the car, headed to the grocery store. What if Beth turns to me and she says, could you slow down? You're driving like a madman. What if I say, acknowledge what she said, and say, you know what, honey? For you, anything. And I back off the gas, right? And I back it off a little bit. Steve, then you've changed your driving. Only momentarily, only while she's in the truck. I'm going to go right back to how I drive when she's not in the truck. But she has offered a bid for connection. Would you mind slowing down? Isn't it wise to answer softly and let her know I've heard her and adjust to meet her needs? A wise person will do that. Dying to self, that's what marriage is about a lot, right? We have a perpetual difference. My wife would rather me not drive as aggressively. I can do that while we go to the grocery store and back. I can do that. And I would be wise to choose to do that. Now, that's not neutral. We are now moving towards one another. She has offered a bid for connection. I have responded by hearing her and adjusting. That doesn't just sit there. That actually builds our connection. You do that time and time again, you are strengthening your marriage. She gets the message, Steve cares about me. My concerns have become his concerns because he loves me. He's willing to humble himself and adjust for my needs. That's loving. We're moving towards each other. We're building connection. So it's not moving away or neutral. It's actually building the connection. We're building the marriage we really want. And that happens day after day, time after time. It's breathing the air of change. Now, what if she used a soft startup instead of a harsh startup, right? The example I gave was a bit of a harsh startup. You're driving like a madman. Could you slow down? Count of 1 to 10, it's about a 7, a little intense there. It takes some maturity to respond well. It would be easier for me, she would make it easier for me if she offered a soft startup. If she said, hey honey, you're driving like you did in Southern California, a little bit of humor. Would you make me feel better by slowing down a little bit? I would appreciate that. That's a nice soft startup. It's going to make it a whole lot easier for me to respond to her bid for connection in kind, right? That's that mirroring thing we talked about last week. Honey, for you, anything, right? A lot of humor can be involved. It's moving towards one another and it builds connection. It's turning towards each other in our perpetual differences because 70% of our differences are going to be there. Again, I'm never going to change how I drive unless she asks me to, and I do momentarily because I want to turn towards her. Let me say this and we'll close. This is one of the primary reasons God authors conflict so often. It is a primary means of bringing about spiritual growth. That's why I go back to saying conflict is not the problem. Resolving conflict poorly is the problem. But if we can breathe the air of change and resolve conflict well, we won't be moving away from each other. We'll actually be moving toward each other and strengthening our marriage. That is how we grow. That is what God is after. I can't think of a more premium environment for God to do that in our lives than marriage, right? It's there. It's every day. It's constant. And it requires a lot of humility, a lot of teachability to your spouse, a willingness to receive influence from your spouse, and to breathe the air of change and respond to your spouse in love. Couples that do that build their connection. They build the marriage that they really want. So I'll close with this question this morning. How are we doing? Right? How are we doing? That is a good thing to ask. Maybe to get before the Lord and say, Lord, how am I doing in the art of arguing well, in resolving conflict in a gracious way with my spouse? And it would be a wonderful thing to ask for. Would you help me, Lord, as I breathe the air of change, as I do action, intentionality, and intensity, and repetition, and trust you to accomplish that work in my marriage? How are we doing? Y'all have been great.